Hi, good evening, everyone. Welcome to our virtual program tonight with the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, A System to Last for Ages, the 1787 Constitutional Convention. As you can see, we are starting promptly tonight because we have a lot of content to get through, but please join us in the chat, letting us know where you are zooming in from as you are logging on to tonight's program. My name is Selena Beemack, and I am the Programs and Communications Coordinator for the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, which was founded in 1824 and proudly serves as Philadelphia's Library of American History. Our collection contains over 21 million manuscripts, including some constitutions or versions of the Constitution, which we will be hearing about tonight. So a few housekeeping notes before we get started. I am going to enable closed captioning, live transcript. So auto transcript is now enabled. If you need to use the closed captioning function, it is at the bottom of your screen. Another note, tonight's program will be recorded and it will be sent to you in a follow-up email along with the survey. We will be taking 2 breaks throughout the presentation tonight for questions, and we will also have time for some questions at the end, but go ahead and use the Q&A box or the chat throughout the program as you think of your questions. And we are in webinar mode tonight, which means we cannot see you and you cannot see each other. But again, if you would like to ask a question, you can use the Q&A, or you can raise your hand on the Zoom toolbar, or you can drop a question in the chat. So we are delighted to host Dr. Stuart Leibiger tonight. Dr. Leibiger, if you would like to come on screen while our guests filter in. Dr. Stuart Leibiger is professor and chair of the history department at LaSalle University. He received his BA from the University of Virginia, his MA and PhD from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and his book, Founding Friendship, George Washington, James Madison, and the Creation of the American Public, was published by the University of Virginia Press. He's written numerous articles on the founders for newspapers, historical magazines, journals, encyclopedias, and has been a historical consultant for television, documentaries, and museums. Dr. Leibiger is also recognized as a former Organization of American Historians Distinguished Lecturer, and in 2015, he won the George Washington Memorial Award, a Lifetime Achievement Award for the study of George Washington, given annually by the George Washington Masonic Memorial Association. In 2016, he received LaSalle University's Lindbeck Distinguished Teaching Award. While I was a student of Dr. Leibiger's at LaSalle University, I am a history alum of both the LaSalle undergrad and graduate history program. So he was one of my professors and actually my advisor while I was there. And most recently, his book, The Constitutional Convention of 1787, was published by ABC Clio in 2019. So without further ado, Dr. Leibiger, I will pass the torch to you for your presentation on the Constitutional Convention.
Thank you, Selena. Let me get my PowerPoint going here. All right, so since I teach at LaSalle University, and since Selena was a star history major at LaSalle University, I thought I would just begin with a couple LaSalle University fun facts. LaSalle University was founded in 1863, just a couple weeks before the Battle of Gettysburg. And we have on our campus at LaSalle University the home of the 18th century portrait painter Charles Willson Peale. Here is Peale's self-portrait. Peale painted all the great men of the age. Peale started a natural history museum in Philadelphia, the first museum in America. Here's another Peale self-portrait where he's lifting the curtain to his museum to arouse your curiosity. A Peale portrait of his family, kind of a neat picture, even has the family pet there at the bottom. Peale raised a whole family of sons who also became portrait painters, and he named each of his sons after a famous artist. And so we have Raphael Peale, Rembrandt Peale, Rubens Peale, and Titian Peale. Here's a Peale portrait of George Washington at the Battle of Princeton. You can see Nassau Hall on the Princeton campus there in the background. And we have on our campus at LaSalle University, the original Peel family farmhouse. Here is a Peel sketch of his farmhouse. And we've got this dirt road here, which is 20th Street, Philadelphia today, which goes right through our campus. And here's a crude Peel sketch in his sketchbook. He was preparing to do a portrait of George Washington, and here are some preliminary sketches. There was one occasion when Peel and all of his sons set up their easels in a circle. George Washington sat in the middle, and all of the Peels painted Washington at once, 5 portraits at once. Somebody commented that Washington was getting peeled all around. All right, on to the Constitutional Convention of 1787, and we'll do just a couple more fun facts here. This, of course, is Independence Hall today. But this is not how Independence Hall looked during the Constitutional Convention. This is how the building looked during the convention. You'll notice there's a major structural difference in the building. And that is the building did not have its tower during the Constitutional Convention. The tower had become decrepit and dangerous, and so it was taken down before the convention. So how did Independence Hall get its name? It was not called Independence Hall during the convention. It was called the Pennsylvania State House because it was the Capitol building for the state of Pennsylvania. It doesn't get the name Independence Hall until 1824, when the Marquis de Lafayette, who helped America win its independence, Lafayette returned to Philadelphia in 1824. And by then, the building was really dilapidated and falling apart. Lafayette was stunned. And Lafayette exclaimed, "Philadelphia, what has happened to your Hall of Independence?" And so the name Independence Hall is born in 1824, and the building is saved. Now, everybody knows what the weather was like in Philadelphia during the summer of 1787. Hot and humid, painfully hot and humid. In fact, though, the hot and humid weather is sort of a myth. Fact, the temperature that summer was actually below normal. Philadelphia enjoyed a cool summer in 1787 with temperatures below average. The month of July was 4 degrees below normal. Now, of course, even a cool summer in Philadelphia can still feel very hot, especially if it's humid. And we don't know what the humidity was that summer. Things can feel especially hot if you're meeting in a sealed room without any ventilation. So the stories of hot weather are not false, but they are somewhat overblown. Another convention fun fact. Here's one of the most important delegates at the Constitutional Convention, Roger Sherman of Connecticut. He helped to engineer the so-called Great Compromise between the big states and the little states over representation. That's why Connecticut license plates say the Constitution State. Only 3 delegates spoke more at the convention than Sherman. Here's a table that I have in the book. I didn't compile it, but it's published in my book for the first time. And it lists the delegates to the convention in the order of the number of speeches that they gave. And so you can see James Wilson, 172 speeches, that was the most. Then Gouverneur Morris, then James Madison. Roger Sherman comes in 4th with 131 speeches. By the way, the convention met in session for 81 days. And so anybody who gives more than 162 speeches is giving more than 2 speeches a day at the convention, which is pretty amazing. But Sherman comes in 4th with 131 speeches. But guess what? Sherman only attended this convention by accident. Connecticut originally selected another man, Erastus Walcott, to attend, but he declined to go. Why? Because Walcott had never had smallpox before. and so he lacked immunity to the disease. Walcott was afraid that if he went to Philadelphia, he'd get smallpox and die. And so Walcott turned down his appointment. And then Connecticut sends Roger Sherman as a last-minute substitute. And Sherman ends up then being one of the most important delegates. That's a great example of what you call contingency in history. A small accident, a chance occurrence, changes the course of human events. All right, one more fun fact. Philadelphia was the biggest metropolis in the US at the time of the convention, with a population of about 40,000 people. It was a center of culture, art, commerce, diversity. And so you would think the delegates must have been thrilled to be meeting in such a fascinating city. Well, believe it or not, many of the delegates hated being in Philadelphia. George Mason of Virginia wrote, quote, "I grow heartily tired of the etiquette and nonsense so fashionable in this city." Mason wrote that on the third day of the convention. He's already had enough of Philadelphia. Or John Langdon of New Hampshire, quote, "Notwithstanding the riches and splendor of this city, the fatiguing sameness makes me sick." Or Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts. Gary compared Philadelphians, quote, "to monks and nuns cloistered in a monastery." One delegate, though, who absolutely loved being in Philadelphia was George Washington. Washington spent 127 days in Philadelphia that summer, and he had an amazing social life. Washington came without Martha. She stayed at Mount Vernon. That summer, Washington went out to dinner 106 times. He went out to tea 72 times, took 13 day trips, attended a concert or the theater 6 times. He sat for artists 4 times and went to church twice. Notice in this painting, this is a Peel painting done during the convention, during the summer of 1787. Washington's wearing his Revolutionary War uniform. He must have brought it with him to Philadelphia. Washington spent that summer as a guest in the mansion of Pennsylvania delegate Robert Morris. The house was on Market Street, and unfortunately, it no longer stands. This house was also Washington's residence when he was President of the United States in Philadelphia from 1790 to 1797. Believe it or not, when Independence Mall was being built in the 1950s, they knocked this building down because they didn't realize what it was. And they didn't realize what it was until after it was gone. Here's the footprint of that building. And one of the ironies here is the slave quarters serving this household. The enslaved people live just about almost exactly where the Liberty Bell is today. So the building was knocked down by accident. And then, to add insult to injury, a restroom was built there. Fortunately, though, early in the 21st century, this open air museum was built to mark the location. So my talk today is based on my book, The Constitutional Convention of 1787, published in 2019 by ABC Clio Publishers. You can see the book is part of a series called Guides to Historic Events in America. I wanted to give the book a subtitle, but a subtitle did not fit the series format, so I wasn't able to use a subtitle. But the subtitle that I wanted to use for this book was A System to Last for Ages. That's a quotation from James Madison during the Constitutional Convention, where he was emphasizing how important it was to get it right at the Constitutional Convention, because we are framing a system of government to last for ages. There are many books on the Constitutional Convention. Mine is about 250 pages, based on primary sources, and factually accurate. Most important, it's a chronological narrative of the convention. When people teach or write about the convention, they often use a topical format that presents the convention as a series of compromises. The large states versus the small states, the North versus the South, federal versus state powers, and so on. I use the topical format in college lectures. The topical approach is organized, it's neat and tidy, but it's a little bit too neat and tidy. In reality, the convention was messy. It meandered all over the place. Nothing ever seemed finalized because every decision of the convention was reconsidered and changed again and again. Instead of using a topical approach, my book is a chronological narrative that captures the complexity and messiness of the convention. A chronological narrative is really difficult to write. I try to tell a story from beginning to end. The convention met from May 25th to September 17th, 1787. The delegates met Monday through Saturday, 5 hours a day, usually 10 to 3. How many states were present? 12. Rhode Island was absent. But 12 states were never actually there at once. Never was there more than 11 states present, because New York left for good before New Hampshire even arrived. And yes, Alexander Hamilton returned at the very end of the convention, but New York was not officially represented because New York needed 2 delegates to be officially represented in convention. 74 delegates were elected to attend by the states, but 19 chose to stay home. And so there's a self-selection process going on with those less sympathetic to a stronger federal government not attending. Maybe the most famous non-attender would be Patrick Henry of Virginia. 55 delegates attended the convention altogether, but only about 40 were there on any given day. And of course, the delegates were rich white men, lawyers, planters, merchants, army officers. Their ages ranged from 26 to 81. Jonathan Dayton of New Jersey was the youngest at 26. And of course, Ben Franklin, the oldest, at 81. None of the delegates, there wasn't a single person there in their 70s. Roger Sherman at age 67 was the second oldest. And George Washington at age 55 was the 8th oldest. Ben Franklin at this point was so infirm that he could not walk the 2 blocks to Independence Hall from his home. And so every morning he was picked up in a sedan chair like this one and carried by 4 men, 4 convicts from the Walnut Street prison, carried Franklin to Independence Hall where he would spend the day. So some sort of work release program from the Walnut Street prison. So what was the charge to the convention? Well, they were given an ambiguous assignment. The Confederation Congress instructed the convention to revise the Articles of Confederation to make them adequate to the exigencies of the Union. But what if a revision of the Articles could not solve the problems of the Union? Then what? Well, the convention's answer to that dilemma was not to revise the Confederation, but to scrap it entirely. Instead, the convention proposed a national government of people because only a national government could save the Union, not a confederation of states. So a confederation is a league of states, with the state supreme to the central government. Also, in a confederation, the central government interacts only with the state governments but does not interact with the people. Only the state governments interact directly with the people. In other words, the states act as intermediaries between the central government and the people in a confederation. And so, for example, the Confederation Congress could not impose a tax on the people. Only the state governments could tax the people. And then it was up to the state governments to give some of that money to the central government. And of course, this leads to a huge problem called free riding, where some states want the benefits of union, but they'll leave it to the other states to pay money to the central government. They're free riders. Maybe when you go out with your friends, you have some friends who are free riders. The Confederation did not have a Bill of Rights. Why? Because the Confederation does not interact with people. And so it cannot violate people's rights and liberties. No need for a Bill of Rights. Under the Confederation, Congress only possessed powers expressly delegated to it by the Articles of Confederation. And so we're talking about a really weak federal government with no implied powers. Now, they want to create instead a national government. That's a government of people, not states. A national government of people, supreme to the states, a government that interacts directly with the people without the states as intermediaries. And so the new national government would be able to tax the people directly. On May 25th, the delegates unanimously elected George Washington the convention president. George Washington was quite silent that summer. He only gave 2 very short speeches the whole convention. Why so quiet? Well, as convention president, Washington wanted to stay above the fray. And he wasn't really that much of an orator. That was not his strength. Although Washington said little in debate, he found other ways to influence the proceedings. One delegate noted that Washington could guide the debate simply by the expression on his face. A smile or a frown from Washington, that's enough to turn the debate one way or another. Kind of how a parent can make a child obey just by giving a stern look. On one occasion, Washington noticed that one of the delegates had carelessly left behind notes at the end of the day, endangering the convention's secrecy. And so Washington takes the notes home. The next day, Washington warned the delegates, quote, "I must entreat gentlemen to be more careful, lest our transactions get into the newspapers and disturb the public by premature speculations. I know not whose paper it is, but let him who owns it take it." And Washington threw down the paper on a table and he walked out. Well, nobody ever claimed those notes. Nobody wanted to own up to being the one that Washington was reprimanding. You know, when Washington reprimanded you, you trembled with shame. We believe maybe those notes belonged to Ben Franklin, but we're not sure. You know, even Ben Franklin too afraid to own up to it. Now, this story, it comes to us from a Georgia delegate named William Pierce. And so Pierce reaches into his pocket to get his notes, and his pocket is empty. And then Pierce panics. Oh no, I'm the one who left behind the notes. I'm the one that Washington was reprimanding. And he, you know, slowly goes up to the table and he looks, and they weren't my notes. They're someone else's notes, someone else's handwriting. And then Pierce goes home and he finds the notes at home in his coat pocket. All right, that's a good point to take a break in case there's any questions.
So actually, we have a great question in the chat that's really relevant, which asks, what role did Washington play in the convention?
Okay, I'll talk about that a little bit later on. Washington plays a huge role in the design of the presidency. And, you know, I think it's safe to say that this convention probably does not create a strong and independent executive without Washington being there. And of course, he brings Another role he plays is he brings tremendous prestige to the convention in the first place, just with his presence. When Washington, when Virginia started, circulating the names of their delegates, they were sure to circulate Washington's name to the other states. Washington is going to attend this convention. Virginia did that before they even knew whether Washington would attend, because they knew that his name would draw a full turnout of delegates from the other states, which is absolutely critical to the success of the convention.
Great.
But we'll talk more about Washington a little bit later.
Awesome. We have one more question in the chat from John asking, did Jefferson attend and will he be coming up? Thomas
Jefferson did not attend the Constitutional Convention because he was serving in France as our minister to France, or ambassador to France, as we call it today. He had taken over after Ben Franklin left, and so Jefferson is out of the country. Also worth mentioning, John Adams was not there, because John Adams was our minister to Great Britain at that moment. So Adams and Jefferson not there.
Great to know. All right, Stuart, I think that's it for now. You want to continue with your presentation?
Okay, sure. So an important but neglected aspect of the convention is the rules that the convention adopted. First rule, voting in the convention was by state. One state, one vote. And so in Independence Hall, we don't have individual desks for the delegates. We have 13 tables, only 12 occupied because Rhode Island's not there. And so all of the delegates from a state talk among themselves, and then they cast the state's one vote. Now, with only 11 states at most there, all it took to carry a vote in the Constitutional Convention was 6 votes. And of course, which states love one state, one vote? The little states love this, because one state, one vote makes little Delaware just as powerful as mighty Virginia, even though Virginia has 13 times as many people as Delaware. And so this rule is really going to help the small states at the convention. Second important rule, any motion that was agreed to could be reconsidered and changed later. And so nothing is ever final. This made it possible for the convention to experiment and take bold chances. But it also made the convention go in circles because nothing is ever finalized until the very end. Another key rule is the Secrecy Rule. The proceedings of the convention were secret. Why did they do that? To ensure that the delegates talk to each other instead of grandstanding for the media. Secrecy allows the delegates to speak their minds freely. And it's okay to change your mind and not be charged with inconsistency. Secrecy makes it easier for the delegates to resist outside pressure. And secrecy minimizes false rumors from spreading about the convention. Most, but not all, of the delegates adhered quite well to the Secrecy Rule. George Washington followed the rule so scrupulously that he didn't even write anything in his private diary about the convention. Now, Ben Franklin liked to entertain delegates at his home in the evenings under the mulberry tree in his yard. Here, Franklin is entertaining Alexander Hamilton, James Wilson of Pennsylvania, James Madison of Virginia. So one night, Franklin brings out one of his scientific specimens to show to his guests. And what it is, it's a two-headed snake that is preserved in a jar. And Franklin's showing all his guests, and then he says, you know, this snake reminded me of something that happened in the convention today. And he starts to tell this story, and then somebody says, wait a minute, Dr. Franklin, remember the Secrecy Rule. And so Franklin can't tell his story because of the Secrecy Rule. So if the convention met in secret, how do we know what happened? Well, there were 10 note takers among the 55 delegates. Madison was the most important note taker because he was present every day from beginning to end. Of the surviving notes that we have, Madison alone took 75% of those notes, and the other 9 note takers combined took only 25% of the notes. Madison wrote shorthand notes during the debates and then copied them out longhand as soon after the session as he could. Here's a page of Madison's convention notes. Madison's notes come out today to about 10 printed pages a day, but that's a 700-page book on the convention. The secrecy rule was lifted when the convention ended, but Madison still felt obligated not to publish his notes until all of them were dead. And Madison was the last survivor. He wasn't the youngest, but he was the last survivor. He died in 1836 at the age of 85. And before his death, Madison arranged for the notes to be published posthumously. They were published in 1840. And so here's the great little Madison, as his future wife, Dolly, would call him. 5 feet tall, 100 pounds. One eyewitness saw Madison and said, "I never saw so much mind crammed into so little matter." Well, why did Madison take notes? As a student of history, he was disappointed that no accounts existed of the founding of the ancient governments. He wanted to make sure that didn't happen to future generations, that they would be able to understand what happened with our founding. Now, how accurate are Madison's notes? Is it a sacred, unquestionable text? In 2015, a scholar named Mary Bilder published a book called Madison's Hand. And she argues that Madison doctored his notes years after the convention to make himself look better by inserting new versions of his speeches later on, to make him look less nationalistic and more anti-slavery than he really was. And that Madison also doctored his notes to make others, like Alexander Hamilton, look worse, to make Hamilton look like more of a monarchist than he was. The problem that I have with this interpretation, if Madison doctored his notes, he was a lousy doctor, because there's so much more he would have changed if he was trying to enhance his reputation. If you read the notes, Madison today, Madison looks very stubborn and uncompromising, a sore loser at times. He bullies and threatens the small states. Now, it is true that Madison did go back and change the notes later in life. He did. He probably should not have tampered with his original primary source after the fact. But Madison saw himself as a historian, reconstructing the original debate, not altering it. And so he was trying to make the notes more accurate. And so we have to remember the notes are a primary source. We need to treat them like any other primary source. It's one person's account of an event. We need to watch out for biases, and we need to corroborate it with other sources. The convention got down to business with Madison's Virginia plan, presented to the convention on the 29th of May by Virginia Governor Edmund Randolph. The Virginia plan was written by Madison, but it was endorsed by the Virginia delegates. The Virginia plan proposed a national government of people, not a confederation of states. It would have a bicameral legislature with representation in both houses based on free population or taxes paid, with the lower house electing the upper house. Congress would have the power to veto state laws that conflicted with the Constitution. There would be an executive judicial council of revision to veto bills before passage into law. For 3 weeks, the convention debated the Virginia Plan in the Committee of the Whole. In the end, the Virginia Plan emerged triumphant with only a few changes. One big change, the state legislatures would elect the upper house instead of the lower house electing the upper house. That was a defeat for Madison because he saw poorly designed state governments as the problem. The state legislatures are too short-sighted. The state constitutions, Madison felt, were not properly checked and balanced, and the result was majority tyranny. For Madison, the states were encroaching on Congress's power. They were violating each other's turf. They were violating the rights of minorities within their borders. But when these men thought about minorities having their rights violated, they weren't thinking about racial minorities because so many of them were slaveholders. They were thinking about other types of minorities like religious minorities. But for Madison, the states are the problem, so let's remove them from the equation. The other big change to the Virginia Plan was the addition of the 3/5 compromise. Enslaved people will count as 3/5 of free people towards representation in Congress. And this was applied to both houses of Congress. And the logic here, many felt that a legislature must represent not just the people, but also the property they own. Representation should be based not just on how many people there are, but on how much property they own, because taxation is based on wealth. And the South has this peculiar type of property called enslaved people that they wanted represented. The South wanted enslaved people to count as 5/5 of free people. The North wanted them to count as 0/5 of free people. They compromise at 3/5. The 3/5 compromise was introduced by James Wilson of Pennsylvania and then seconded by Charles Pinckney of South Carolina. Now notice, Wilson from a big state and Pinckney from a deep South state. This is the coalition that will back the Virginia Plan, the large states and the deep South states. The large states, Virginia, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, and the deep South states, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. That's 6 states, that's a majority that can carry a vote in the convention. And what the big states get is they get representation in both houses based on population, and the deep South states get the 3/5 compromise. And so the small states are an isolated minority. Madison of Virginia, he is riding high. He won't budge an inch. But by being so overbearing, Madison forced the small states to come together in opposition. On June 15th, William Patterson of New Jersey presents the New Jersey Plan as an alternative. And at that moment, John Dickinson turns to Madison in anger and frustration, and Dickinson says, quote, "Now you see the consequences of pushing things too far. You were too stubborn, you were too unbending, you have provoked a backlash from the small states." So the New Jersey Plan then would keep a confederation and add executive and judicial branches to it. It would keep 1 vote per state in a unicameral legislature. It would grant Congress the power to regulate commerce, but revenue would still come from the states based on population. And so Delaware and Virginia, Delaware and Virginia would have equal representation in Congress, but Virginia would pay 13 times as much money in requisitions to the central government. And so the large states would never agree to this. On June 18th, Alexander Hamilton delivered a long speech that helped to kill the New Jersey Plan. Hamilton praised monarchy as the best form of government and questioned the viability of Republican government. Hamilton called for an incredibly powerful central government consisting of a president and Senate for life. Some argue that Hamilton's plan was not serious, that it was intended to make the Virginia plan look reasonable in comparison. But Hamilton was serious in that he wanted the American government to come as close to monarchy as possible. The New Jersey Plan is voted down after only 4 days on June 19th. But the small states drew a line in the sand. They demanded state equality in at least one house of the legislature. And so you have this impasse over representation. It lasts through the rest of June and into July, and it gets ugly, and it threatens to break up the whole convention. At one point, Rufus King of Massachusetts, a big state guy, he looks right at the delegates from Delaware and he says, you know, we can do this the big state way based on population, or we can just break up the convention and go home. And then all the states will become separate nations. Now, that was a threat to intimidate Delaware, because little Delaware really doesn't want to be a separate nation. But the Delaware guys were not going to be intimidated. And so one of the Delaware guys looks right back at King and he's, you know, this is Gunning Bedford of Delaware. And he says, fine, let's go home right now. Delaware will become a separate nation. And then Delaware will ally itself with a European power for protection. Well, that's the founders' worst nightmare. The states break apart, start allying with European powers, warring against each other. America becomes like Europe. It got so ugly that Ben Franklin, of all people, asked that a minister be brought in to pray with the delegates. Franklin, the man of science and enlightenment, seeking divine intervention. Well, the Connecticut delegates start hinting at a compromise. And what the convention does is it ends up appointing a grand committee of a delegate from each state, a grand committee of 11, to deal with this representation issue. And then the convention stacks the committee. From the large states, they put all compromisers on the committee. From the small states, they put all hardliners on the committee. And who gets left off? James Madison. This bodes really well for the small states. And sure enough, this grand committee proposes the Great Compromise of July 16th. The House of Representatives will be based on state population. The Senate, equality, equal numbers of senators per state. And that Great Compromise passes when the Massachusetts delegation deadlocks and North Carolina switches its vote over to join the little states. The Great Compromise created what James Madison called a compound republic. It's part national, it's part federal. The House is national, it's elected by the people. The Senate is federal, it's elected by the states. And so what the Senate does, it protects the small states with state equality, but the Senate also protects the states as states. It gives the states a check on the federal government because it's the state legislatures that will elect it. So the purpose of the Senate is twofold. It protects the small states, it protects all the states as states. And so legislation would have to be backed by a majority of the states in the Senate and by a majority of the people in the House of Representatives. The Great Compromise is a turning point or milestone moment in the convention. From then on, it's clear this convention will agree on a constitution. It's just a matter of ironing out the details. That will be time consuming, but there's light at the end of the tunnel. From then on, the small states support a strong central government. From then on, the big states, now wary of a powerful Senate controlled by the states, the big states now want to shift some of the Senate's power over to the president, like appointment power and treaty power. All right, that's a good place for our second question break.
So we have one question in the chat right now. How did they enforce the rules at the convention?
I guess they would have, parliamentary procedure. There were rules. There were other rules that I didn't mention. Delegates were not allowed to read books during the meeting of the convention. They had to listen respectfully to the other delegates. I guess today you'd have a rule: no cell phones in the chamber, and that could be enforced by the president calling out people who aren't following the rules. But other rules are very difficult, if not impossible, to enforce, like the secrecy rule. How do you keep people from talking about what's going on out of doors? You really can't enforce that unless somebody files a complaint against somebody else. And so that's really the honor system. It's up to the delegates to enforce that one on their own.
Great. On another question, did the delegates from each state conspire with one another throughout the convention?
In some cases, I think they did. And I highlighted maybe the best example of that, where, it's Pennsylvania of all states that proposes the 3/5 compromise. And so it seems like they had gotten together with South Carolina, Pennsylvania representing the big states, South Carolina representing the slave states. And, we'll support the 3/5 compromise if you support representation based on population. And then you get that big states, deep South state alliance that, really starts to run the show for a large part of the convention. So, so there is some of that going on behind the scenes among delegates from different states.
Interesting. All right, let's finish up our presentation.
All right.
Thank you.
So this great compromise of July 16th, it was actually a devastating defeat for Madison, a bitter defeat that he didn't want to accept at first, but it's really just the beginning of Madison's defeats. Next, this veto, this congressional veto of state laws gets defeated, and it gets replaced with the Supremacy Clause. Then Madison's idea for a council of revision, an executive judicial council of revision to review laws before, or to review bills before passage into law, that gets defeated, and it gets replaced with a presidential veto and judicial review. Now, judicial review is not written into the Constitution, but the delegates did understand that it would exist. Madison wanted this council of revision because he thought the legislative branch would be too powerful, as they were in the states, and that the president would be too weak to veto a bill. The Supreme Court would be too weak to strike down a law by judicial review. So why not combine those two branches with this council of revision? And so here then is a list of Madison's defeats at the Constitutional Convention. At the end of July, the convention appointed a committee of detail to prepare a first draft of the Constitution. And so all of the agreed upon resolutions so far, which you see here from the collections of HSP, they were given to this committee of detail. Most of the work on the first draft was done by James Wilson of Pennsylvania. He prepares the committee of detail draft. He's a member of a 5-man committee, but he does most of the work. And so he prepares the committee of detail draft, again, from the collections of HSP. Wilson's committee of detail draft add some new features to the Constitution. It enumerated the powers of Congress for the first time, instead of just sort of a blanket grant of power. But Wilson also included a necessary and proper clause to give Congress some implied powers. So very different from the Articles of Confederation, which had no implied powers. Wilson's draft also included tremendous new protections for the South and slavery. The international slave trade into the US would remain open forever. Slave imports could not be taxed. The draft required a 3/4 supermajority in Congress to pass commercial laws. That would give the South a veto over commercial laws it didn't like. During August, Northerners, especially, oh, here we go. Here's the characteristics, the details of Wilson's first draft. During August, then, Northerners, especially Rufus King of Massachusetts, they fight back against these pro-South, pro-slavery provisions, and they're able to scale them back. Instead of remaining open forever, the slave trade can be shut down by Congress in 1808. Eventually, it was. Slave imports could be taxed. And this provision for a super majority for commercial laws gets completely removed. All it takes is a bare majority to pass commercial laws. In return, the South secured one additional benefit, a fugitive slave law. And of course, the word slave is never used in the Constitution. It's always such persons or other persons. Designing the presidency is perhaps the most difficult challenge of all. The dilemma, how do you create a strong and independent executive, but not one that is so strong that he can become a tyrant? That is not an easy balance to strike. But in the end, the convention goes against the whole grain of the revolution. They create a strong and independent executive in a revolution against a strong executive, the king. Why did the delegates do that? They had a pretty good idea of who that first president was going to be, and they knew he would not abuse his power. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say the Constitution, the presidency part of the Constitution, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that's written with Washington in mind. And here's the real reason for Washington's secrecy at the convention, or the biggest reason. So much of that summer is spent designing the presidency. And it's just not appropriate for the guy who's going to hold that office someday to take the lead in designing it. He has to be silent. But I think it's amazing. Washington shapes the whole presidency, and he does it without saying a word. Now, these debates over the presidency, they would go in circles because the delegates would say, well, what powers should the president have? Well, we can't decide what powers he has till we know how he's elected. So let's talk about how he's elected. We can't decide about how he's elected until we know how long his term's going to be. So let's talk about how long his term's going to be. We can't talk about how long his term's going to be till we know whether he can be impeached. Let's talk about whether he can be impeached. We can't talk about whether he can be impeached till we know what powers he has. And so you went in a circle and you're right back to square one. Now, the plan for just about the whole summer, right up till the end in September, the plan was that the president would serve one 7-year term and the president would be elected by Congress. But the delegates were never really happy with that. It's not a truly independent executive. It's more a creature of Congress. It's not until the last 2 weeks they take the presidency and they just shove it to a committee called the Committee on Postponed Parts. And this committee redesigned the presidency, gave the president a 4-year term, made him re-electable, elected by the people through an electoral college. What a huge last-minute change. But, you know, the delegates finally decided, we trust Washington so much, let's go ahead and make that leap of faith and create a truly strong and independent executive. In the convention's closing days, George Mason asked for the inclusion of a Bill of Rights. In haste to wrap things up, the convention overwhelmingly voted down a Bill of Rights, a huge mistake that almost prevented the Constitution from being ratified. Remember, the Articles of Confederation does not have a Bill of Rights because it doesn't interact with people. The states are intermediaries between Congress and the people. But this new Constitution, a national government, it will operate directly on the people. The states are not intermediaries, so it really should have a Bill of Rights, shouldn't it? Well, the delegates thought no, because Congress only has enumerated powers and nothing more. And so to add a Bill of Rights would imply a very dangerous thing, that Congress can exceed its enumerated powers. Now, all the state constitutions have bills of rights, but the state constitutions are written differently from the federal constitution. The state constitutions give blanket grants of power to the states, and then you carve out your rights with a Bill of Rights. But again, the federal constitution is not written that way. It enumerates the powers of Congress. That's all Congress has, so there's no need to carve out your rights. Everything else belongs to the people. Madison at the time, and shortly afterwards, sarcastically called a Bill of Rights, quote, a parchment barrier. It's just words on a sheet of paper. It's not going to protect people against a tyrannical majority. The way you protect people is not a Bill of Rights. It's how you design the government. It's checks and balances among the branches and levels of government, not a piece of paper. And we did that already. We built the checks and balances into the Constitution. We don't need a Bill of Rights. Madison would say, look at the state constitutions. They all have Bill of Rights, yet the rights of citizens in the states get trampled left and right. And so the Bill of Rights doesn't do anything. Well, Madison would, of course, change his mind about parchment barriers and then go on to become the father of the Bill of Rights. The final Constitution was written by Gouverneur Morris of Pennsylvania. There's Washington presiding over the convention. Gouverneur Morris of Pennsylvania, he was a brilliant writer and quite a character, really. He had a wooden leg because he lost his leg in a carriage accident, 1782, on Dock Street in Philadelphia. Morris had a reputation as being quite the womanizer. And so when he lost his leg in the carriage accident, his friend John Jay wrote, and this is true, John Jay wrote, you know, it would have been better if Morris had lost something else in the carriage accident. Morris wrote the final draft of the Constitution, including the preamble. He organized it into 7 articles. The convention also wrote an often forgotten cover letter that accompanied the completed Constitution. You know, once the Constitution is written, what is the convention supposed to do with it? Where do they send it? The convention considered issuing a proclamation to the American people, but decided against that. Instead, the convention sent the completed Constitution to the current existing government, the Confederation Congress in New York, accompanied by this cover letter. The cover letter is addressed to Congress, but it's really aimed at the American people, and it appeals to their hopes rather than to their fears. And here is that cover letter, again from the collections of HSP. It's a beautifully crafted document that justifies the convention's decision to overthrow the articles. The letter reads, individuals entering into society must give up a share of liberty to preserve the rest. And the letter argues the same goes for the states. The states entering into a national government must also give up a share of their power to preserve the rest. The finished Constitution was signed on September 17th. And here's the printed version of the finished Constitution, again from the collections of HSP. Now here's a trivia question for you. 55 delegates attended the convention. 41 of them were there on the last day. 3 of them refused to sign the Constitution. So how many signed? Well, 41 minus 3 equals 38, right? Wrong. There's 39 signatures on the Constitution because one delegate signed twice. George Reed of Delaware signed for himself, and he also signed for his fellow delegate, John Dickinson, who was absent. Ben Franklin's most important speech, there's the signatures of the delegates. Ben Franklin's most important speech came on the last day, calling for unanimous support among the delegates. Everybody should sign. We all have our objections, but let's put our doubts aside and give this thing a chance. But still, there were 3 delegates who refused to sign. All 3 feared the convention would lead to monarchy or aristocracy. The 3 non-signers, George Mason of Virginia, Edmund Randolph, also of Virginia, and Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts, 3 non-signers. As the delegates were signing the completed Constitution, Ben Franklin pointed to the back of George Washington's chair. And he said, you know, all summer I've been staring at that half sun carved into the chair, trying to figure out, is that a rising sun or a setting sun? And now I know finally it's a rising sun. But perhaps Franklin spoke prematurely because the Constitution still has to be ratified by the American people, which was going to be a bit iffy. As Franklin was headed home from the convention on the last day, this woman stopped him in the street. Elizabeth Powell, the wife of Philadelphia's mayor. And she said, well, doctor, what have we got? A republic or a monarchy? And Franklin replied, my dear, what kind of a government have we got? We've got a republic, if you can keep it. A republic, if you can keep it. The founders launched an experiment in Republican government, an experiment in a world of kings and monarchs. And it was going to be up to the American people to make the experiment work. And it's really not clear until the end of the Civil War that this experiment is a success and that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. One final story. Here's the City Tavern on 2nd Street, a modern reproduction of the original building. On September 14, 1787, which is not the last day of the convention, but just about, the delegates held a dinner in honor of George Washington. I just want to share with you the final bill for that evening. Dinners for 55 gentlemen, £20 sterling is the cost. 54 bottles of Madeira, £20. 60 bottles of claret, £21. 8 bottles old stock, £3. 22 bottles of porter, £2. 8 bottles of cider, £1. 12 bottles of beer, £1. 7 large bowls of punch, £4. Cigars, £2. Wine glasses broken, £1. Dinners for 16 musicians, £2. 16 bottles of claret for musicians, £5. 5 bottles of Madeira for musicians, £1. 7 bowls of punch for musicians, £2. Well, this adds up to 89 pounds sterling. That's 3 bottles of alcohol per person, not to mention all the punch. And 89 pounds, that's obviously a lot of money. In today's dollars, it's something like $15,000. And so these men, they knew how to reward themselves for a job well done. Now, I mentioned these musicians. Let me just read some of their names to you. Think about who are these guys? The musicians: George Christleth, Mr. Schultz, Mr. Trenninger, John Kaiser, William Hartung, Philip Rothe, David Kartzrock, John Brunner, Conrad Spangenberg. Well, those are all German names, right? How did these guys get here? They came to America as Hessian soldiers, British mercenaries hired by the British to come over and fight. George Washington captured 900 of them in the Battle of Trenton. And then Washington offered his German prisoners amnesty, just become American citizens. And many of them did. And they settled in the Germantown section of Philadelphia, many of them, which is where my school, LaSalle University, is. But it's such a wonderful American immigration story. You know, these guys come here to fight George Washington. They end up playing their instruments in honor of George Washington at the Constitutional Convention. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Stuart. That was excellent. Now we are past time, but we do have a few questions, so I will pick one or two. So the first question I see is, how many delegates at the Constitutional Convention were present at the Continental Congress?
You know, I can't give you the exact number, but it's a handful, somewhere around 8, 9, 10, something like that. And a handful of them are going back and forth during that summer between the Continental Congress, actually, technically the Confederation Congress in New York, and the Constitutional Convention. So it's a handful of them. Luther Martin, for example, of Maryland, some of the Georgia delegates. So there's a handful of them going back and forth.
Now, not a question per se, but a fun fact to add to your list is that today coincidentally happens to be James Wilson's birthday.
Oh, I did not know that.
Yes, so coincidentally, it is James Wilson's birthday. And of course, this Saturday is Constitution Day, celebrating the day that the Constitution was signed. All right, well, we are way over time, so that just about, no problem, just about wraps that up for us. We have some great comments and the questions in the chat. Thank you for joining us tonight. By showing up and spreading the word, you're supporting the work we do to preserve, including our constitutions here at HSP, which I am putting a link in the chat. Make sure you're subscribed to our newsletter at hsp.org/easenews, and we will be sending out the recording, the chat, and the links to Dr. Leibiger's books in a follow-up email. And that's all from us. Have a great night, everybody.